תודה רבה. On their wanderings throughout the Muslim East, the fictional narrator and hero of Zechariah al-Dahiri's Sefer ha encounter people of different backgrounds and traditions. As they seek to articulate what sets Yemenite Jewry apart, they express their perceptions of these others as well as of their own community. On the metatextual level, these constructions of literary identity are a means for al-Dahiri to communicate a sense of self to his Yemenite Jewish audience. When the characters come into contact with Jewish communities in other lands, their pronouncements can be read as authorial attempts to differentiate Yemenite Jewry from other Jewish subcultures, even though they all share a religious and textual heritage. And when Mordechai Tzidoni and Avner ben Chelek Atemani confront imaginary Muslims, al-Dahiri's depiction of these interactions often tells us more about internal Yemenite Jewish self-perceptions and communal anxieties than about the Muslims themselves. This paper undertakes a fresh reading of al-Dahiri's 16th century narratives using some of the critical concepts furnished by the anthropological turn in historical and literary studies. This is a perspective that has not yet been applied to Sefer HaMusar. Previous scholarship has preferred to read the work as a travelogue and to comb it for historical facts, without acknowledging its complex literary nature or the social categories and processes refracted through its stories. This paper suggests that we read the protagonist's self-perceptions as a means for al-Dahiri to bolster his community's sense of identity in the face of instability at home and contact with different Jewish subcultures abroad. The accomplishments of the Jews of the Holy Land come to the attention of Mordechai and Avner on visits to Tzvat and Tiberias, and through contact with a shadar, or rabbinic emissary, who is sent to Yemen to collect funds for the Tiberias yeshiva. In these episodes, the protagonists express the highest regard for the print culture and halachic, exegetical, and Kabbalistic expertise of the Jews of Eretz Israel. Their uncritical admiration is coupled with an apology for Yemenite Jewish deficiencies in precisely those areas. In an elegant letter, Avner lavishes praise on Rabbi Avraham Ashkenazi, the Shadar, whose erudition in scripture, Mishnah, and Talmud is profound due to assiduous study in the yeshivot of the land of Israel. Conversely, he apologizes for the Yemenites' lack of excellence in Talmud, which he ascribes to the absence of yeshivot from their communities. Observing the yeshivot of Tzvat and Tiberias, Mordechai feels woefully inadequate in the face of so many fine Talmudic minds. In his letter, Avner apologizes for the wretched and humiliated Jews of Yemen, whose dire circumstances prevent them from receiving the visitor with the acclaim and respect that befits him. The Yemenites cannot compare in wisdom or wealth to the Jews of Turkey, Greece, and Egypt, who undoubtedly gave him a proper reception. In response, the sage remarks on Avner's extraordinarily eloquent and clear language, tzachut lishono, and exclaims that even though in our land there are discerning sages, before his poems all would be speechless, for they cannot compose a poem in this manner. The picture of Yemenite Jewry emerging from these maqamat is painted with broad strokes. It portrays an oppressed minority plagued by poverty and humiliating maltreatment at the hands of the Muslim authorities. In Talmud study, Yemenite Jews fall short of their co-religionists in other lands, particularly the land of Israel, but they excel at Hebrew poetry and rhetoric. There is a distinctly subcultural element implicit in this contrast, which marks virtuosic expression in pure biblical Hebrew as the preserve of Yemenite Jewry. But why is Talmudic expertise acquired through study in a yeshiva taken as the measure of a community's worth? Was this an imported notion conveyed via printed Hebrew books brought to Yemen by shadarim or merchants? Clearly, the protagonists and al-Dahiri are aware that other Jewish subcultures placed supreme value on immersion in Talmud and intricate halachic reasoning. Scholars have long maintained that the Yemenite curriculum favored biblical and midrashic study over elaborate halachic dialectics, and that pre-modern halachic works favored practical legal applications. Nevertheless, direct, often lengthy quotations of Talmud are evident in the rich medieval genre that Tzvi Langerman has called philosophical midrash, 14th to 16th centuries, and Talmudic erudition is manifest in rabbinic responsa from subsequent centuries. For our purposes, the real question is why al-Dahiri would have found it useful to repeat these essentialist claims in forging a communal self-definition. Even if poetry and rhyme prose tend to work with typologies and formulae rather than subtleties and fine distinctions, this does not adequately account for his omission of Yemenite accomplishments in science, philosophy, exegesis, and halakha. After all, the closing chapter of Sefer Musar celebrates al-Dahiri's own achievements in several of these realms, as well as in Kabbalah, which he helped to transmit to Yemen via his Makama and Torah commentary. Surely he must also have been aware of the works of his illustrious predecessor, David Aluel ben Yesha Halevi, in philosophy, exegesis, astronomy, and other fields. Why then does al-Dahiri feel obliged to restrict his community's accomplishments to linguistic virtuosity and poetic mastery, even if these were areas in which Yemenite Jewry historically distinguished itself? Even if his narrative of oppression and decline accounts for portions of his negative assessment, it does not entirely explain it. Rather, it would seem that the subtext driving his construction of Yemenite Jewish identity is the need to defer to the Jews of the land of Israel. Why would he have felt this so keenly? Not just because an aura of sanctity envelops the Holy Land, its scholars, and institutions. The most compelling reason seems to be that in al-Dahiri's eyes, the leading lights of the land of Israel and their disciples are all Sephardim. This identification is made explicit in several instances. In a letter praising the sages of Tiberias, Avner names several of their leaders and proclaims, "They are the sages of Sfarad." Elsewhere, he notes that in Tzfat, the most illustrious names of the day are all Sephardim. The character's direct encounters with Sephardim take place in Eretz Israel. These fictionalized meetings are set against the backdrop of a historical reality and demographic shift resulting from the massive influx of Iberian Jewish exiles to the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 15th century and throughout the 16th. Establishing their own congregations, the newcomers asserted the preeminence of their Sephardi heritage. They gradually imposed their customs and legal traditions on the Romaniot Jews indigenous to the Balkans and Eastern Mediterranean, as well as on Jewish communities of other ethnicities. We should note that al-Dahiri was not only aware of Sephardi claims to superiority, but also appears to have accepted and internalized them. However, his idealization of the Sephardim takes the rabbinic and scholarly elite as representative of the subculture as a whole. He also assumes a homogeneous category that did not fully apply, as 16th century Ottoman Sephardim were divided into many different congregations formed on the basis of their places of origin. His Yemenite character's self-assessment also glosses over regional and class differences, projecting the preoccupations of the San'ani religious and intellectual elite, to which al-Dahiri belonged, as paradigmatic of the subculture as a whole. The protagonists defer to the Sfaradim not only in Talmud study and Kabbalah, but also regarding a highly sensitive marker of difference, namely the pronunciation of Hebrew. In chapter 23, Mordechai discovers that Avner is the melodious chazan and inspired payatan in the synagogue attended by the head of the Tiberias Yeshiva. Mordechai voices his concern that Avner's Arabic-inflected Hebrew might offend the sensibilities of the patrician and learned Sfaradim of Tiberias. I know that your poetic imagination is full, but I would like you to tell me, who appointed you Chazan? After all, you come from a distant land. How is it that they wanted you, when our speech is close to Arabic and is alien from the spirit of the West, the spirit of the Sfaradim, the choicest of Jews? We are a people brought low. Our faces are covered with thorns. They are expert in Talmud and Gemara, and all of them are masters of Svara. I am amazed and astonished. How did you achieve such a distinguished rank? Here again, Mordechai's unquestioning acceptance of Sephardi exceptionalism leads to self-critique and abasement. If the choicest of Jews, imbued with the spirit of the West, would find Hebrew pronunciation that is close to Arabic distasteful and crude or somehow undignified, then by definition this distinct marker of identity brands Yemenite Jews as inferior. It is striking that al-Dahiri seems to have succumbed to a kind of internal Jewish Orientalism, or perhaps we should say Occidentalism, whereby a noticeably Eastern trait so intrinsic to his own community is deemed inferior to its Western counterpart. Obviously, the notion of the West has here become a cultural construct and should not be understood in purely geographic terms. While their families originated in the Iberian Peninsula, presumably not all the Sfaradim in Safed and Tiberias were by this point literally from the West, many having arrived via Salonika or Egypt. Avner's pronunciation of Hebrew betrays not only his geographic origins, but also the cultural milieu from which he springs. It also highlights a differentiation in social status, insofar as these chapters counterpose the humiliation of the downtrodden Yemenites with the proud ethnocentricity of the Sfaradim. If Avner's Arabicized Hebrew accent risks assaulting refined Sephardi ears and ruining their auditory pleasure, then pronunciation also has aesthetic implications. Of course, in al-Dahiri's day, there was no universally normative pronunciation of Hebrew for liturgical purposes. Thus, the unfamiliar pronunciation of a chazan from a different region and subculture could also have halachic implications. Despite Mordechai's doubts, the Tiberian congregants insist that Avner be appointed chazan without further delay after he is invited to recite a special piyut on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. Their praise for the poem's eloquent language and pleasing form indicates that they in fact derived aesthetic pleasure and spiritual uplift from Avner's performance, regardless of his pronunciation. Seen from this perspective, al-Dahiri's narrative subtly vindicates, perhaps even celebrates, the Yemenite accent in Hebrew, and thus reinforces a positive sense of communal identity. On the rare occasions when the protagonists journey west of Egypt, they remain within an Ottoman sphere. But even so, in the Balkan region of the Eastern Mediterranean, Mordechai's descriptions of the Jewish communities he encounters are largely a product of his imagination. In chapter 41, he relates that he traveled from Turkey to a city in the provinces of Roma, determined to find a tradition regarding the end of days. Here, Roma renders the Arabic Balad Arum, a term designating formerly Byzantine and now Ottoman lands. Mordechai wandered until he found himself in a city whose inhabitants, he says, were Ashkenazim. His brief, colorful description of these Ashkenazim is intriguing, for in his eyes they have an air of mystery and exoticism, even though they are fellow Jews. Mehem ba'kochavim chozim, umehem yod'im b'chochmat harazim, umehem mechabrei charuzim, lefanim hayu sarim betzo'an, uleshonotam medabrot sfat Kenaan. Among them were stargazers, connoisseurs of esoteric lore, and rhymesters. In days of old, they were noblemen in Egypt, but they speak the language of Canaan. In medieval texts, the phrase Sfat Kenaan was used to refer to the language of Slavic peoples. From a historical point of view, Mordechai could certainly have encountered a local community of Ashkenazim in the Balkans or Turkey. Ashkenazi communities lived side by side with the indigenous Romaniotes in these lands well before the massive influx of Iberian Jews. Moreover, according to Cecil Roth, it appears that Salonika was a regular station for Jews from Russia traveling to Palestine in the High Middle Ages. So in theory, Mordechai's description could fit either Romaniotes or Slavic-speaking Ashkenazim. The Romaniotes of the Balkans and Asia Minor were for centuries Greek-speaking, although the use of their Greek dialect declined from the 16th century with the ascendancy of the Sfaradim. It is conceivable that the exotic label Ashkenazim, which occurs nowhere else in Sefer HaMusar, is a misnomer for the Romaniot Jews. If so, calling them Ashkenazim would resemble a type of reverse Orientalism that uncomprehendingly lumps together all unfamiliar Jewish subcultures from beyond the Islamic cultural orbit. But even if Mordechai is referring to bona fide Ashkenazim, he makes no mention of their halachic practices, liturgical customs, or scholarship. Apart from noting their foreign tongue, what captivates him is their astrology and access to esoteric wisdom. In the local synagogue, Mordechai discovers Avner and tells him of his desperation to learn when the exile will end. In response, Avner questions that the end of days and its secrets are sealed for reasons hidden from on high, but adds that it is possible to hasten the redemption by cultivating unconditional trust in God and acceptance of suffering in great love. To illustrate, he tells the tales of an Arab who clung to his faith in God and another who accepted his terrible misfortunes in love. These virtues call to mind the Islamic pietistic ideal of tawakkul, Hebrew bitachon, that had gained currency through Bahya ibn Pukuda's book of guidance toward the duties of the heart. Avner urges his Jewish listeners to draw a lesson from these tales. But in doing so, he betrays his ambivalences about Muslims, whom he contrasts with his Jewish audience of true believers. And if this was the recompense of an Arab from the sons of Kedar, who had no form or beauty, the reward would be many times over for us, the believers, kata ma'aminim. These exempla are presumably chosen from outside of his fictional audience's habitual frame of reference, whether they are Ashkenazim or Romaniots. But Avner feels no need to adapt the materials. In fact, on the metatextual level, al-Dahiri tells these cautionary tales for the benefit of his own readers, as part of their Yemenite Jewish universe of discourse, which is thoroughly embedded in its Islamic milieu. His fixation on the date of the redemption betrays real anxieties about historical Muslims and Jewish vulnerability in Yemeni Muslim society. Like the genre of al-Faraj ba'da shidda, these tales pose a moral challenge while promising relief after hardship. Presumably al-Dahiri first encountered the tales orally in Arabic before transposing them into his elegant written Hebrew. In his adaptations, there is an implicit tension between receptivity to cross-cultural models and acknowledgement of the religious, political, and social boundaries between Muslims and Jews. Although al-Dahiri's fictional characters have uprooted themselves from their customary settings, their preoccupations remain keyed to their distinctly Yemenite frame of reference. They use their Balkan encounter not to gain insight into an unfamiliar Jewish subculture, but rather as a fruitful vantage point from which to examine their own communal concerns and sense of identity. Finally, al-Dahiri's literary representations of Muslims, whether historical or imaginary, are also vehicles for communal self-fashioning and self-legitimation. They reveal an acute consciousness of the Jews' dhimmi status in Zaidi Yemeni society. Al-Dahiri's references to historical Muslims reflect alienation from the rival religion at whose hands his people were suffering grinding oppression and humiliation. And yet, the protagonist's encounters with imaginary Muslims go some way toward redressing the sense of powerlessness and desperation born of these historical realities. In their confrontations, al-Dahiri's invented Jews often overstep the accepted dhimmi bounds of propriety and discretion to prevail over their Muslim opponents. By manipulating the expected outcomes of Jewish-Muslim interactions, al-Dahiri constructs a Jewish literary identity that is audacious, clever, and even invincible. A fictionalized account of a Muslim-Jewish religious disputation unrealistically allows the Jewish participant to triumph. And an outlandish story of one-upmanship between three thieves depicts the Jew as more cunning, resourceful, and literate than his non-Jewish rivals. Despite the dangers inherent in openly polemicizing against Islam or tricking a Muslim religious judge, al-Dahiri repeatedly ensures that his Jewish characters emerge with the upper hand. By engineering these implausible victories, whether serious or comical, he responds to Muslim accusations of theological inferiority and political impotence. These veiled gestures of resistance address his community's faltering sense of legitimacy in the face of their inferior, vulnerable status in Yemeni Muslim society. By couching his subversion of authority in Hebrew-rhymed prose, al-Dahiri restricts his inflammatory remarks to an internal Jewish readership, thereby avoiding Muslim scrutiny. And by inventing these scenarios of Jewish bravura, resilience, and control, he offers his readers an internal sense of self that transcends their condition of political powerlessness and religious marginalization. To summarize, the cross-cultural encounters of al-Dahiri's fictional characters lead them to highlight perceived markers of difference that distinguish Yemenite Jewry from Jewish and non-Jewish others. On a metatextual level, these constructions of literary identity convey a communal sense of self to al-Dahiri's readership. When the protagonists confront imaginary Muslims, al-Dahiri devises a triumphant Jewish literary identity that runs counter to grimmer historical realities. When they encounter unfamiliar Jewish communities, they do not gain any real appreciation of these different subcultures. Rather, al-Dahiri uses these points of contact as a springboard to focus on the distinctive characteristics and concerns of their own community. Even their more extensive exposure to the Sfaradim of Eretz Yisrael generates cultural stereotypes and reductive self-portrayals. These various constructions of identity can be read as authorial responses to the community's precarious status in Yemen and to new demographic, cultural, and spiritual developments elsewhere in the Jewish world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this. Please. We have time for 2 questions and 2 answers. You can stay here. Any questions, please? David, please.
Thanks, David.
Okay.
So his book is a makama,
Yeah.
a genre which is most famous in the Jewish world as a Spanish adaptation and creation. And so I think we have to assume that he is proud of his achievement in writing this book, in this kind of book. And so that leads me to imagine that all of this talk about the inferiority of the Yemenites because they're only strong in poetry and language, but weak in Gemara, Talmud, and so on, is, I don't know whether it's lip service or tongue-in-cheek or something like that, and that the message, the subtle message is that we are actually superior. But of course, the problem that I have with that is that the object of his ethnic conflict or competition is Sfaradim, who are the balabait over this type of literature. So that's where I'm struggling to figure out how, on the one hand, I have to assume that he is actually sending a message of our talents and power, on the one hand, while on the other hand, overtly stating that it's the Sfaradim who are superior by virtue of their halakha, gemara, and so on.
So thank you for that question. I think we have to distinguish between the 16th century Sfaradim, whom the characters encounter, because I'm not denying al-Dahiri's mobility, but I'm also not necessarily identifying his travels with those of his fictional characters. But I think we have to distinguish between the Sfaradim whom they encounter in the land of Israel, who are adept at Kabbalah and are erudite in Talmud, and who have print culture. These are the things that he singles out. Distinguish between them and the earlier Andalusians, who are very much a model for al-Dahiri. And in fact, in his introduction to the work, which is fairly terse and laconic, he does single out al-Kharizi, and he says, I am basing myself both on al-Kharizi, who is a tremendous master of this genre of makama, who in turn based himself on that brilliant Muslim author, al-Hariri, who of course that is the paradigmatic makama on which all subsequent makamat are based. So, but I think you're right that he definitely plays up the eloquence and the rhetorical virtuosity of Yemenite Jewry, and in many of the maqamat, obviously I had to leave out all kinds of stuff, in many of the maqamat, and it's a standard plot for the rogue hero to be disguised and then to reveal himself or be discovered, his identity is discovered at the end of the maqama. Avner comes along in disguise, and Mordechai, the narrator, at some point there's a recognition scene. He realizes who he is, and he plays up his skills to whoever the observers in that particular setting happen to be. And he says, this man is an outstanding poet, and all sorts of things along those lines. So definitely, he's certainly claiming those strengths, those literary strengths, for his own Yemenite Jewish community. Thank you for the question.
She already answered.
Okay.
What was the question?
About Al-Kharizi, so you already.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Well, I've got a general question, not about the contents of the book,
Yeah.
but about its outer form. Whether do it possess any traces of the reading tradition of these books? I mean, I can imagine how this book was produced. So it was cold. It was a manuscript. How was it read? Was it I read? Was it read aloud? Do we have any traces of? I don't mean just this specific book. I mean the whole
Right.
book.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Kleiner, for that question. And this is something that I try to address in the monograph that I'm working on, the whole question of the performative context. And unfortunately, at least I'm not aware of any corroborative, information. Clearly, maqamat, certainly earlier maqamat. I mean, we know there are letters of Al-Hamadani, which, and also I think there's information about Al-Hariri, that these things were performed, in the village square. People didn't necessarily have the book in front of them. And even though Al-Dahiri is interesting because he's operating at a period of time where other communities have printed books. Of course, in Yemen, there's no press, and there's an ongoing manuscript tradition, so things are still being copied by hand. So it seems logical that these things would have been performed in public. Shmuel Moreh had an argument that this is also related to, certainly in the Arabic tradition, that it's related to street theater and all sorts of, performative genres like that. So it would be lovely if we uncovered some information that said, oh yes, I went to a reading of Sefer HaMusar. I've not come across anything like that to date, but my sense is, this is obviously anachronistic, but it's much, much later. Mordechai Yitzhari, who republished the work recently, in his introduction to his printing of Sefer HaMusar, he says, I knew a couple of these maqamat by heart from the time that I was a child, because during the time of the Takhzina, we would sit around and recite Sefer HaMusar, which suggests that there was a continuity in terms of the oral performance of this maqama, even though, the text existed in manuscript and was copied out. So clearly there's a performative aspect to the work.
Thank you. Okay, thank you again, Adena. Our next speaker is Mark Wagner from Louisiana State University, and he will talk about Shapazi and Sufism, a corpus analysis. Mark did his doctorate in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. The doctoral dissertation became a book on evaluations of the Yemeni genre among Arabs and Jews in Yemen. He wrote a second book on Jews and the Sharia in the 20th century, and in Yemen, of course, and now he's working on the new book about the 18th century Yemeni Muslim comedian and his world. Mark, please.